Hello again, my name is JT Lieber, and this is going to be chapter 1 of Jung's The Red Book. It's called Refinding the Soul. We're continuing on with our series, and in this chapter, Jung begins by talking about the image he saw of the flood, and that at that point in his life, he was about 40 years old, very, very successful man. He had all the honor, all the power, success, wealth that he ever imagined that he wanted. He was very happy about this. But what occurred was that he no longer had the desire to grow in those directions. The worldly things no longer had as much appeal. And in fact, that desire itself ebbed out of his life. And so he came to sort of a crisis. I mean, today I think sometimes we might call it the midlife crisis. Jung referred to it as the second part of one's life. After they've gone out and conquered, explored territory, explored the physical world, they look for what's inner. They look for that inner world, the spiritual world. And that's when things like virtue and meaning and value really start to become more important in one's life, especially if they're able to find the high level of success that Jung has. Now, as you can see, I'll show the images here of the facsimile. The section begins with a large drop case D with a picture of a dove in it. So that's both an allusion, obviously, to the flood image that he saw, and refers kind of to the story of Noah as he sent out a dove to see that the waters had receded. And so the idea of like a fresh beginning, a new phase for humanity, for Jung, for individuals as they go through life, and the certain things that once had an appeal, the fame, the glory, status, as those things wane, what comes up behind it. So, Jung then goes on to call out to his soul. He realizes that his soul was something missing from him, that he wasn't exactly going through life with his soul. Hence the chapter name, Refinding the Soul. So, Jung also states that it was the depths that came up from behind him and caused him to call out, even though he didn't exactly know what this meant at this time. And so Jung calls out to his soul. He says, "I've traveled the world. I'm dusting off my feet. I come back to you clean and tempered." So it's kind of allusion back to the Bible verse that began from Isaiah 35, that the unclean shall not be able to travel the path. And so Jung here is saying he's purified, he's ready to go. And he's ready to come back to his soul. And an interesting part, Jung points out that one thing that he has learned on his sojourn without his soul was that one must live this life. It's the only way to grow, to gain knowledge, is to be a part of this life, no matter where that might take you. And so Jung calls out to his soul. And he says he's ready to journey onward with his soul into his solitude. Now, what does it mean that Jung didn't have his soul? As somebody very successful, especially the kind of work that Jung has produced as a psychologist, it seems that the soul would be an integral part of who he is, and that the soul would be behind his work, pushing him forward. But what he points out is that he took a very scientific approach to the soul. And he said it's in line with the spirit of the times. That he saw the soul as a property of the human being. So that the human being is the one who is able to judge and have knowledge of the soul. But what he was coming to learn, and this is from the spirit of the depths, this other current, was that it's actually the soul whose proper domain has judgment and knowledge. So whereas before he saw the soul as an attribute of the human being, he now sees the soul as being something distinct and its own living being outside of the human being. So that's why he had to re-find his soul. His soul is actually not just him. It's not just his physical body. And so he has to go and re-find and reconnect with this part of him that actually is the part that comes forth through the human body. So the spirit of the times wants us to think that we can conceptualize this soul, that the words we put, the scientific words that we put, that we can put the soul into a box and contain it and define it, when in fact it's the soul that is coming through us. And the soul is the one who is having this experience of knowledge and wisdom. It's a very important distinction to see that the spirit of the depths sees the soul as a living and self-existent being, whereas the spirit of the times sees it as something that's dependent upon man. It's a very different take, very different perspectives. He then goes on to talk about desire and what desire is. And desire is a very interesting phenomena. There's this idea now, and it's also an ancient idea, that we must be rid of desire, that one should have no desires, that to perfect ourselves spiritually is to be desireless. In Buddhism, nirvana literally means the extinguishing of the flame of desire. But desire is a weird thing. It's hard to pinpoint, right? Because it takes on different shapes and different forms. You know, if we see somebody beautiful, somebody beautiful of the opposite sex, or the same sex, however, whatever wells up within you, right? Desire itself can come forth, and that feeling of just pleasure and of wanting, it's very natural and it's very in the moment. But then there's this desire that comes along later, when maybe we're thinking about the beautiful woman or the beautiful man, and we think about that feeling that we had. And we think about how we would like to possess them, or to have them, or to be with them. We can have the same thing with objects, with cars, money, houses, stuff like that. There's this initial feeling, this desirous feeling, and it's pure. But then there's also the process of thinking about having that thing, and really just wanting to have it. It's a little bit different. It's as though instead of desire itself, it's almost desiring the object. It's like desire once removed. So it's an interesting thing to think about. What is the real nature of desire? How do we experience it in our lives? Jung goes on to talk about desire as an image, and that man could actually put a hand on his soul if he could directly touch his desire. That desire itself comes from the soul. But then there's a distinction he makes between that raw desire and then the object of desire. Right? So there's that raw emotion and that feeling, and we have it all the time. And the interesting thing about desire is desire can be contradictory. We may have a desire to be sober, and yet we may also at the same time want to have a drink. We may have a desire to be healthy and fit and strong, and yet also have almost an undeniable desire to pick up some fast food on the way home. and to have a soda, or some candy, or some cake. So I wanted to take a moment and visit desire from a gentleman named Jiddu Krishnamurti, who I think is very clear and succinct when it comes to desire, because he doesn't exactly tell you how to handle it. And he points out the fact that desires can be contradictory. So if you don't know who Jiddu Krishnamurti is, I'll put a link in the description that will give you some information about him. He's a fascinating story, and I'm sure I'll do videos on him in the future. But this is from his book, The Book of Life, and I'm sure this was compiled after his death. But it's a meditation for every day, and I wanted to read a couple that were on desire. So here we go. We have to understand desire, and it is very difficult to understand something which is so vital, so demanding, and so urgent, because in the very fulfillment of desire, passion is engendered, with the pleasure and the pain of it. And if one is to understand desire, obviously there must be no choice. You cannot judge desire as being good or bad, noble or ignoble, or say, I will keep this desire and deny that one. All that must be set aside if we are to find out the truth of desire, the beauty of it, the ugliness, or whatever it may be. And that reminds me too of the depths rising up in Jung, and almost these things that seem counterintuitive. You know, the idea of everydayness, of smallness, being a part of the divine. And so, how can we meet those things? How do we have to be able to meet these darker aspects of ourselves that we typically want to deny. You know, we all have thoughts and even desires that in retrospect we're disgusted by, or we may feel are wrong or evil, or that we shouldn't have those kinds of thoughts or desires. But as Krishnamurti points out, I think it's important that we actually see those things for what they are and not condemn them. Because as soon as you condemn a thing, especially your own self, you're creating conflict within. You're denying some aspect of yourself, whether or not your logical mind wants to accept it or not accept it. It's a part of you, this desire that may be something you don't exactly want, or you may have contradictory desires. So we have to kind of take a step back and try to take this holistic viewpoint. And I don't mean holistic in any sort of spiritual context there, but a further back view that takes in desire and the contradictory nature of it, and is able to view it without saying, yes, this one, no, that one, right or wrong. And in the same way, this is what Jung is doing as he's going into the depths. He's having to look at these other aspects of himself that many people may not be comfortable looking at. But it's an essential part to growth. It's an essential part of the path. Jung also talks about the image being a part of desire. And he uses the word image in a very interesting way. He talks about how images are of the soul, and they're actually half of the world. So to possess a thing, to have a thing, there's the physical having of it, but then there's also the image of it as well. And it's really kind of a strange wording and a strange concept. But the way he points it out towards the end of the chapter, excuse me, the way he points it out there at the end of the chapter is that a man who holds the image the desire of anything has half of the world. Even if outwardly and physically he has nothing, he can still possess half of it. And there are people who own material objects and things, but do not have the image. This inner, deeper picture. And it reminds me of idealist philosophy. Which is a whole other subject I don't want to go deeper into. But there's a philosophical idea that the world is actually composed of ideas. And that's the actual reality underneath. And here Jung is saying that's half of it. That's half the world. The other half is physical. And the idea is to possess both of these things at once. And in the last few sentences of this chapter, Jung states that images are of the soul. And to not have these images, and to not be fulfilled by them, the soul will become hungry, and it will devour anything in its path, and that you will breed snakes and dragons in your heart. And so that's a very, very stark warning against not nourishing your soul. And you nourish your soul with these desires and the images and having a hold of them. So there's a lot of questions there, like what exactly does that mean? What does it mean to possess the image of something? To hold the idea. So I think we have a lot more to learn as we move forward. And hopefully we get a little bit more clarification. And I do want to read one more section from Krishnamurti on desire. Let us go on to consider desire. We know, do we not, the desire which contradicts itself, which is tortured, pulling in different directions, the pain, the turmoil, the anxiety of desire, and the disciplining, the controlling. And in the everlasting battle with it, we twist it all out of shape and recognition. But it is there, constantly watching, waiting, pushing. Do what you will, sublimate it, escape from it, deny it or accept it, give it full reign. It is always there. And we know how the religious teachers and others have said that we should be desireless, cultivate detachment, be free from desire, which is really absurd, because desire has to be understood, not destroyed. If you destroy desire, you may destroy life itself. If you pervert desire, shape it, control it, dominate it, suppress it, you may be destroying something extraordinarily beautiful. So again, I think this is the process Jung is diving into here, is to understand desire and to understand his soul. And so that's where the depths come in. That's where there's this going under. Because instead of living in the spirit of the times that may tell you not to have that desire and to suppress your desires and to fall in line, and that the soul is just a byproduct of being a human, maybe just an allegorical metaphor. In fact, the soul is strongly related to desire. Desire stems from the soul, and the soul is where knowledge stems from. So in order to really understand the soul, you have to understand desire. And to understand desire, you must open yourself up to yourself, to those things that you may be trying to hold back or hold down. You may have to go down into the depths and see yourself in a way you've never seen yourself before. And not that you say yes or no to those desires, but you see those things are in fact within you. And so, I look forward to continuing our journey into the depths. Until next time, goodbye.